Howdy, I'm Radical Liberation here in St. Louis, Missouri, United States. Um, a relatively somewhat strategic point for our main geographic place to be for our main topic. And we have Mad Mercenary from Australia, who's going to get us started with a couple short things to a very and important main topic. So go ahead, sir.
Hello, everyone. Yes. First off, I have found this rather delightful channel on YouTube from a nice lady called Praxi Girl. Now, first off, no simping. I know what you people are going to do. No simping. Secondly, this channel goes straight towards praxeology and going in depth in short little 3 or 4 minute videos as to what is praxeology, what isn't praxeology, and just explain all the little minutiae around that. And my praxeology is the study of human action, and it is a fundamental point to understanding economics, and especially Austrian economic perspective. So if you want to have praxeology and the fundamentals of that broken down for you in bite-sized pieces, um, we all know that Hans Hermann Hoppe and Murphy lectures can be quite daunting, going on for an hour and a bit. So if you want just broken down to simple bite-sized pieces, go to this channel, say that we recommended her channel to you,
Yeah.
and honestly, really good content and no simping from any of you. Don't want to see it.
She might be a good guest. We should consider that. I like what you did there by saying no simping. What you're effectively implicitly saying is that there is something simpable about her, sympathetic. I don't know what word to use here.
Uh,
You didn't say it,
just go watch.
but you
Go
kind of
watch the
implied it.
videos. No simping. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah,
Go
at
watch the
least not
videos.
for at least not for days, as Jay Brewski reminds us here.
Yes.
Till the end of September.
No
Okay,
simping
excellent.
ever.
Yeah, I do remember watching a little bit of her content, and it was quite good. So I'm really glad you brought her up. And I'm not kidding that I don't know that we've really done just sort of like a basics show, like what is praxeology? Why do we talk about human action? Anyway, just jotted down in our list of ideas for shows to see if she'd be up for doing something like that with us, where we just do a sort of intro to praxeology kind of thing for our audience.
Indeed.
Anyway, cool, awesome. Thank you for bringing her up. I knew about her channel and just kind of forgot. In fact, I better make sure I'm subscribed. Well, you talk about the next thing. Go ahead.
Right. Next thing, guys. As you know, we have been running a currency design, and it's just a fun way for us to all get involved as a community and have a look at some aesthetically pleasing designs that our artists in the server have made. And the winner, obviously, will be, as I've harped on about, getting some silver mailed to them. Now, many people have been asking about a date for the end of submissions, so we have finally come up with a date, and that date is the 23rd of December. Again, that date is the 23rd of December. You have until 11:59 p.m. to GMT on the 23rd of September to get your submissions in. On the minute of 24th of December, the channel entry room will be closed and locked off from any other submissions. And if you don't have your submission in, you don't have a chance to win some silver and be a part of the fun. So, again, that date is the 23rd of September for the currency design competition and for entries. Good luck, and I hope you have a fun time making your designs, because we're going to have a fun time reviewing them.
Yeah. Yes. And how shall I put this politely? The coins are funded. we are ready to buy those coins. So let's put it that way. Okay. So let's get into our main topic. I wanted to make a couple of introductory comments because I feel like I'm reacting to some degree to some of the things I see, even from people who I like quite a lot. People like Sargon and people like this, and that is just that. How do I put this? If you walk away from history and you've got a lovely story of black and white hats and the glorious victory of goodness and stuff like that, I feel like you've or the opposite, that all you get is blackpilled from history, then I think that you're not doing it right. My experience of learning about history is that it is a little bit somber because it isn't a nice, easy black and white story. It's always more complicated than the cartoon version of history that we tend to get given. So anyway, I just wanted to say, because we are getting into a topic that's kind of a hot button topic, especially this year, talking about the history of Black Americans and starting with the history of slavery. And there's some things that there'll be facts in here to offend everyone. Let's put it that way, to destroy your simplistic history that you've got in your head, because history just isn't that. It's more complicated. So anyway, I just kind of wanted to lead off with that before we get into this. Let's see. First, I did not want to spend a bunch of time on this, Mad Merc, but I did want to just do a sweeping pre-history of slavery. I don't know if you had a bunch to cover before we get to the Americas, slavery in the Americas, starting in the 1600s. But I did want to just really quick talk about ancient slavery, the abolition of slavery in medieval Europe, and very briefly Islam and slavery. Is that okay? Starting point, sir?
Go right ahead.
Okay, so first of all, I'll give you the punchline ahead so you can be watching for it as we go. And that is that slavery has historically been the result of war, not commerce. That is what we're going to find as we do this economic history. But we can even see it as we do this sweeping history, because the first example, as Gordon Tullock, who we'll be getting into in a moment, Gordon Tullock points out that there seems to only be two historical examples of slavery being a long-running institution, meaning not just that there's the occasional slave here or there, but that slaves represent a significant proportion of the population, a significant portion of the people actually getting work done. It's being done by slaves. There's really only two times in history that we see a major significant presence of slavery like that. The first is the Britishers' favorite people, the Romans. And I'll be commenting on them a little bit, especially with the Gordon Tullock paper, because it's interesting to compare and contrast Roman slavery with the slavery that's nearer to us in time. And again, giving away the punchline a little bit, the thing to note about Roman slavery is that it is heavily tied to war. They're slaves, they got them when they went to war. All right. And times when Romans were getting slaves from war, things were very different for the slaves than times when there wasn't a big influx of slaves, because Rome was relatively at peace. Those tended to be very different experiences for the slaves, in fact. We'll understand better later why that would be. The other thing that I wanted to make sure to bring up, because this bothered me a lot in some current debates, this is why I mentioned Sargon, I think. I really sympathize a lot with those who would, defend I think is a glorious story of the modern abolition of slavery in the United States, and in the United States, glorious. But prior to the war between the states, there were some impressive developments, I think, in the United States. And then in the British Empire, it is just, I think, a glorious story out and out. And so you know that statue of Thomas Jefferson, William Wilberforce, something like that. I think they really are ignorant. Having said that, there's a defense of them that I just can't let pass because it just doesn't fly. And that is that, you know, slavery was just always there from the beginning of time, and they didn't know any better. And what's amazing about them is that they thought that they had the moral insight to say, hey, maybe slavery should not be a thing. And wait a second. I don't know how to turn that off. Okay. They had the moral insight to say slavery shouldn't be a thing. And that's what's really impressive about them. Yes, you know, I think, like I said, William Wilberforce, Thomas Jefferson, people like this do deserve a great deal of credit. I really do. Having said that, slavery was not always a thing. It came and went. And in particular, I'm sure there were various factors, but I think Christianity probably had a good something to do with it. We see that in medieval Europe, slavery was essentially ended. When we talk about abolition, we tend to talk about what really should be called the second abolition in you know, European culture. There had been abolitions before. In fact, I think it's worthwhile to actually look at this real quick. Also, because I'm always happy to look back at medieval times. Let me just share this. So we actually have in Wikipedia a timeline of the abolition of slavery and serfdom. So this is here's an early one. This is really early, 590. In Pope Gregory I bans Jews from owning Christian slaves. You'll see that come up again. Only Christians, by the way. As you'll see later, Jews it would be not allowed for Jews to own slaves, but they could own other people as slaves. Let's see. Carolingian Empire, 840, Venice. Venice pledges to neither buy Christian slaves in the empire nor sell them to Muslims. 873, Pope John VIII declares the enslavement of fellow Christians a sin and commands their release. Slave trade banned in 960 in Venice. Serfdom in Normandy in 1100. In England in 1102, the Council of London bans the slave trade. Let's see. This Aragon one, I like this. Mercadarians founded in Barcelona with the purpose of ransoming poor Christians enslaved by Muslims. We'll talk about Muslim slavery in a moment. Okay, now listen to this. Around 1220, Holy Roman Empire. The most influential German code of law from the Middle Ages condemns slavery as a violation of man's likeness of God. And then in Aragon, 1245, James V bans Jews from owning Christian slaves, but allows them to own Muslims and pagans. And I was feeling a word come to my mind when I read this earlier, and now I realize what it is. Based, I guess, is what I would imagine someone saying about that. But anyway, okay, so yeah, so we see, and then this is key. In France, Louis X, 1315, he publishes a decree abolishing slavery, proclaiming that France signifies freedom. Any slave setting foot on French ground should be freed. And then it says that there were some exceptions to that, but by and large, that was the case. Slavery abolished in Sweden in 1335. Notice the years here. We're talking 700 years ago. These things are happening, right? And so on and so forth. So what is the lesson from this? This is interesting. 1493, Queen Isabella bans the enslavement of Native Americans unless they are hostile. They're ruled to be subjects of the crown. Columbus is preempted from selling Indian captives in Seville, and those already sold are tracked, purchased from their buyers, and released. So that's interesting. And I know that the Spanish scholastics were influential in arguing for the dignity of the Native Americans. That they couldn't just be treated as animals. So there's actually a pretty good history there that I don't hear talked about much, and I think it puts a little bit of a lie to the story that, they just didn't know any better. You can't blame being men of their times. Well, that's partially true. Thomas Jefferson was, by the time he came around, slavery was well established in the colonies, right? But it wasn't time out of mind. You could go to plenty of places in Europe at that time and find that slavery was not allowed. So I think we go, some go too hard on someone like a Thomas Jefferson, and some go, I think, a little too easy. It's a little more complicated than that. And there were people all along from this time onwards who resisted slavery when it started to reestablish itself in the New World and places like this, and argued against it morally, from the Christian point of view. And you had, basically proto-libertarians who were arguing against it, based on, the rights of man and that sort of thing. So anyway, that sets a little bit of the stage for that. Let's now talk about slavery and Islam. I don't have anything but those numbers, really. I just didn't have time to dig into this topic. Mad Merc, did you have more to say on Islam and slavery than just the sheer numbers, which we'll share?
Islam and slavery is a bit more complicated. Unfortunately, there's a lot to go into with Islam and slavery, so I'll just go through the history. Is the Islamic slave trade from North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and further off to the east around Persia. These slave trades were operated for much longer periods of time, from the beginning of history, with the Indus River Valley civilizations. And as we know, many of the first human life came from near Iraq. So a lot of these societies had a much more prevalence of slavery and much more ingrained.
Yeah, so you're saying it wouldn't be quite fair to just say this was an Islam thing. Well, it wouldn't be quite fair to say this was a Muslim thing, because it was already there in that part of the world, and they kind of inherited it, is what you're saying, right?
Right. But Islam, through its unified caliphate, brought a complexity and a range to the slave trade across Africa, especially North Africa, that wasn't seen before. Just like any empire that is able to connect and secure those lands for trade. Now, we have the raw numbers, and the lowest number I could find for the Islamic slave trade was 12 million. And the average number I could find for the Islamic slave trade over a much longer period of time than the Atlantic slave trade was 17 million.
And the point is that the Atlantic slave trade is estimated to be 10 to 12 million. So at the high end of the Atlantic estimate, the low end of the Arab or Islamic slave trade, they were about equal. Everyone I read, it seems to strongly suggest that we expect that many more sub-Saharan Africans were put into slavery by the Muslims than were sent to the Americas, with millions more.
Right. But we have to remember that, again, as I was saying, the Arab slave trade happened for over a much longer period of time than what the Atlantic did. And so, that puts a bit of a wrinkle into our calculations there. But the Arab slave trade was different in the sense of the Atlantic slave trade in reproduction of slaves. So just to give a bit of history here, we'll probably get into when I go through the history of the Atlantic slave trade. many people stopped importing vast quantities of slaves later on in the latter half of the Atlantic slave trade, because they found that slaves would reproduce at rates that they no longer needed to import new slaves to supplement their ranks of the ones that were killed in slavery. This was not the case in the Arab slave trade. In the Arab slave trade, men were castrated, and this is why you in the Middle East these days you don't see many black people. It's all ethnically very much Arab or Persian or Kurd, even though there were many more millions of black people who went to the Middle East, and
Right.
these people were the males were castrated.
Right. And so I think at this point we should pay a little bit of tribute to the canceled historian, David Starkey, who got canceled because effectively he was making the other side of this point. He said he was saying, and just his wording is what got him in trouble. Well, his wording and also what he was saying, but basically he was saying that the European slavery was not genocide. And he said, if it was genocide, then why are there so many blacks around, right? Well, this is the other side of the story that was probably in Starkey's head and would have probably helped people have better context for his comment. That is, you can legitimately call the Islamic slavery of the Saharan Africans genocide because there aren't blacks around. They as you said, they really they would import them, castrate them, and they were, wiping them out as a people as they brought them in. So that is, if you want to throw the term genocide around referring to slavery, it would be much more apropos for the Islamic slave trade than the European slave trade, which obviously allowed blacks to reproduce and not wipe them out, which is what genocide means, right? Wiping them out. To say something that is not genocide doesn't mean it's a good thing, to be clear, but words have meanings, and genocide means you're wiping people out. The Arabs basically did. They'd import them, use them, and then that was the end of them. The Europeans allowed them to reproduce. So, and that's why you have black populations in the United States and Brazil and so forth.
Right, and we should just briefly, although it's not our main topic, on the Islamic slave trade. Many of the kingdoms that were selling these people into slavery, like the Mali kingdom, genuinely didn't treat their slaves poorly like the Arabs did, or as later on the Europeans did. As far as we can tell from the historical record, many of the slaves from the kingdom of Mali, a sub-Saharan African kingdom, which we'll later see on a map, were treated more like house servants or indentured servants who were there to pay off a debt, rather than the mass enslavement that we would see on a plantation or in the farms of the Ottoman Empire. So we should be very clear that not all slavery is the same in its brutality, and that on an economic side, the slave trade from the Arabs to the sub-Saharan Africans was much more direct. The Arabs would trade goods for slaves, and the slaves would be shipped back in caravans. And on the way, many of the slaves would the male slaves would be castrated, the females would be regularly raped and beaten, and then afterwards they would be sold on to other customers. Obviously, there is a financial incentive, as we'll get into later, is to not brutalizing your slaves too much, as there's a monetary cost to that, as disgusting as it is. But in the Arab world, it was commonly accepted to castrate the males so that they would not interbreed with the Arab population.
All right. So anything else on that? We'll actually touch on a little bit more on some of this history as we go. But that's probably about all we'll do on Islam and slavery, because that's, we're not Muslim and we're not in the Middle East. So neither of us are. So we're not going to really focus on that. Oh, I did want to share one comment real quick from Right Honorable Fez. and I didn't know this, Starkey was specifically responding to recent attempts to equate slavery with the Holocaust. Right. So it seems like Starkey would have done himself well to say, there's so many blacks around here that's not comparable, really. What about what happened to all the black Africans who were shipped to the Islamic lands? Oh, I know one more thing to mention, which was mentioned in passing in talking through the medieval abolition, and that is that they didn't just enslave sub-Saharan Africans; they also enslaved Europeans. And I am told that that is where the word slave comes from. And I wonder if that's Slav, or maybe it goes the other way.
A Slav is basically, in all sense of the term, a slave, but Eastern European or European, Central European slave tied to the land. Again, we went through this as you briefly went through that timeline of Slav isms being repealed over time. Obviously, the notable exception to this, the repealing of Slavs, was Russia, which held on to Slavs well into the 19th century. But just on the Islamic slave trade, very quickly, you will hear the Barbary Coast. The Barbary Coast was quite notable for taking many, many Europeans. I believe. Now I could be very wrong here, but something of upwards of 500,000 Europeans were taken as slaves across the Barbary Coast, which is in North Africa, and sold throughout the Middle East and the Ottoman Empire and different North African and Middle Eastern kingdoms. So
What was the number you said there?
I believe it was 500,000, but I'm not quite sure on that,
Okay.
and please do not quote me on that. But
Okay, I found something on the Slavs.
That's just from memory. But that's actually, on a quick side note, not to go on a tangent, but that's where the Marine song "On the Shores of Tripoli" comes from, when the U.S. Marines were sent by Thomas Jefferson to deal with the Arab slave traders on the Barbary Coast, who were taking Americans and British and French peoples as slaves. Just a quick history there.
Yeah, I think I remember that. So I looked up the derivation of slave, and they say that they trace it back to Old French from medieval Latin sclavus, originally Slav, so used in the secondary sense because of the many Slavs sold into slavery by conquering peoples. And then they quote from the Cambridge Medieval History. The oldest written history of the Slavs can be shortly summarized: myriads of slave hunts and the enthrallment of entire peoples. The Slav was the most prized of human goods. With increased strength outside his marshy land of origin, hardened to the utmost against all privation, industrious, content with little, good-humored and cheerful, he filled the slave markets of Europe, Asia, and Africa. And about many dying on the way. Anyway. Yeah, so again, history is always more complicated, right? And the picture many in their mind of slaves is that they're sub-Saharan, but there were many slaves that were from Europe and would have been white. Do Slavs count as white? Okay, so let's get into, if it's all right with you,
main topic.
Yeah, some economic this stuff. So I want to start with Gordon Tullock. Gordon Tullock, you might know from his work on public choice theory with why do names leave my mind? Give me a sec. Good guy. Let's see. I'm sorry, a sort of an Austrian calculus of consent. There we go. Buchanan, James Buchanan. Yeah, Buchanan and Tulloch wrote the calculus of consent, which had to do with public choice. Anyway, that's his background. But there's a journal called Left and Right. In fact, it's sort of interesting that it existed. I'd like to show you here. Here we go. This is the paper I'll be drawing from. Left and Right was a journal that I think Rothbard had a lot to do with, if I remember correctly. And it was during this period, I think, where he was trying to work with the New Left, sort of build bridges and stuff. And so the editor, which I think was Ron Hamowy, one of a friend of Rothbard's, asked Tulloch to write this paper. So anyway, Tulloch's fun because he moves fast here and covers a lot. As I said, he claims only two large-scale examples of slavery: the Greek-Roman classical world and the system which grew up on the east coast of the Americas, from Brazil to Virginia. Another thing that's confusing me, and maybe that's just, we're in the Anglosphere, right? So what part of the east coast of the Americas from Brazil is the Anglosphere? Well, the part that became the United States, right? The English colonies in the North America. I don't seem to hear very much about slavery in Brazil, which you've already pointed out ended later, quite a bit later. Well, I'm sorry, let me be careful. It didn't end up that much later, but the slave trade had ended quite a bit before the slavery ended in Brazil. Anyway, he makes this point that I think of as a Hoppe point, but Tulloch had already made it. And this is very important, I think, for our show, and that is the distinction between public and private slavery. So in talking about slavery, he starts to compare it to socialism, and he said, enslaved labor camps might be considered a third example, along with the Greco-Roman classical world and the Americas, of a long-running institution of slavery. And he says it was, in fact, in whether they were economically profitable to the Soviet, first turned my attention to the problem of slavery. On careful examination, however, it appears that there are clear distinctions between the Stalin labor camp system and Hitler's smaller scale experiment with the same system and private slavery. As a single example, the death rate in the camps was much higher than any private master who had to pay for the purchase of replacements would permit. And I think, Mad Merc, you were already pointing at this, right? Which is that when you own a slave privately, then essentially you're looking to get benefits from your purchase or raising. It was actually more expensive to raise a slave than to purchase one. But anyway, from your purchase or raising of a slave, you're expecting to get like lots of work out of them over the years, right? So if you beat them to death or work them to death, you were going to lose out. Quite apart from humanitarian concerns, the slave owner would literally lose economically. So we don't see, as Tulloch just points out, we don't see the kind of death rates in chattel slavery that we do in what Hoppe called public slavery, where instead of being owned by an individual property owner, you're owned by the state or all of us. You're a communist slave, right? So I think it's really worth emphasizing, because it really blew my mind the first time I saw this. It was in Hoppe, that to think of the labor camps as being a form of slavery, but I think it's quite right. And as Tulloch's pointing out, the thing that distinguishes it is not only private versus public ownership, but the fact that the people just died in terrible numbers, high percentages in the Gulag Archipelago, in the Soviet Union, in work camps, labor camps of the National Socialists, German National Socialists, and in other examples we can point mostly of communism, right? Communist labor camps. They worked them to death, basically, because who's going to lose out if you work this guy to death? You're not going to. The person running the camp. It's no skin off your nose. So anyway, there's a perverse incentive of communist slavery, and of course the ultimate success of the communist goals, we would effectively all be in that situation. Our labor would be fully owned by the state, and there would be no individual, ourselves or anyone else, who would have an interest in our health and well-being. And if the communists ever win, really win, even more than they won under the Soviet Union, then it would be like, a big global concentration camp, basically, with the death rates that you could expect from that. So, sobering thought. Okay. So, Tulloch says the slave owner can only make a profit on his investment if this amount is enough less than the wages he would have to pay free labor to do the same work. Since slave labor is notoriously inefficient, this means that the difference between the sustenance given a slave and the current wage rate must be substantial. So what's he bringing up here? He's saying that there's a trade-off between free labor and slave labor. Slave labor is less efficient. And so you're going to have to justify the cost of raising a slave by, purchasing a slave if you're buying from the slave trade. You're going to have to justify that against just hiring somebody, where you don't have to get a big upfront cost to either raise them or purchase them. And so it's actually harder than you'd think to justify that cost of buying slaves. The other issue with slavery, I'm bringing up things that make it unlikely for slavery to continue as a system, because remember, what is the puzzle he's bringing up? He's saying, ignore the communist Nazi situation for a moment. He's saying that the big examples of chattel slavery are Greco-Roman and the Americas more recently. And he's basically saying, well, why? Why didn't it happen like all the time? Like, if slavery is so great, if it's so profitable, which some people would say, if it's so profitable, then why wasn't it just a constant factor in human life? Now, we know there were always sort of like, family servants and stuff. You see this in the Old Testament. But we're not talking about that. We're distinguishing from that. And we're talking about slaves as a major aspect of the economic system. And that we only see in those two cases. And he's basically saying, why? Okay, so another factor militating against a slave system is security costs. And the way it was dealt with in both the Roman case and America's case was that those costs were borne by the non-slave holding free population. So in the case of the wars of Rome, the costs of the wars were borne by the Romans, or, the regular Romans. They were paying for these wars through taxes or whatever. And then, as we'll learn a lot more about later, there were laws, costly laws, that maintained the slave system in the Old South. So he's saying if those costs had fallen exclusively on the slave holders, he doesn't think the system was likely to have survived. It just wouldn't have added up. Instead, the costs were largely put upon the free population by some form of conscription. And we'll learn more about what that looked like in the South soon. And this quote from George Fitzhugh is really essential, I think. He was a pro-slavery theorist, mind, as you hear this. He said, "The poor constitute our militia and our police. They protect men in possession of property, as in other countries, and do much more. They secure men in possession of a kind of property which they could not hold a day, but for the supervision and protection of the poor." So this is Fitzhugh, who's arguing for slavery, and he's saying, how is this system working? It's basically because we, how do you want to put it? Conscript, at least in part, the efforts of the poor whites. Okay. So another factor, now turning more to focusing on the Americas, another factor that made it hard to keep the slave system going was the development of concentrations of Negroes. This is from a paper in the 60s. So, Negroes who were free because they would provide shelter for runaways. If you had a large enough group of free blacks, then it would be difficult to tell that one more slipped in who had been a slave, right? So the Southern legislators started to put laws to try to keep a free population from developing. We'll learn about that, more about that soon. Right, so slaves were exported from Africa to the United States only before 1806, but to Brazil as late as 1870. Okay, so I didn't understand that. It sounds like the slave trade actually continued until 1870. It stopped in the United States and in the United Kingdom in around 1807. 1807 for the UK. Go ahead.
Yes. So I do have these statistics on, well, not statistics, but date on when each country who participated in the slave trade actually outlawed slavery, the slave trade itself, maybe not slavery.
Mhm.
If you like those.
Yes.
Correction,
I
slavery.
guess
Yes.
verbally go through them, I guess, right?
Great. So just going through the initial powers, Spain ended the slavery in 1811. Portugal ended slavery in 1869. So there's a fair difference in the two there.
Oh, and remember, it's Brazil. They speak Portuguese, right? So the tie between Brazil and Portugal is what's relevant there. That's why we're hearing 1869 and then 1870 for Brazil, right?
Brazil didn't end slavery until 1888.
Oh, wow. So the slave trade was ended in 1870, along with Portugal, I suppose. But then they continued to have slaves for another 18 years after that. Okay, I didn't know that.
Yes,
Thank you.
because there were new methods of self-sustaining slaves that weren't available before. When we'll go to the history of the slave trade after we're done with the economics, so we can tie it all together in a nice little bow, we'll see why certain areas got a far disproportionate amount of slaves and the turnover rate was much higher, simply because of the conditions and structure of the administration there. But that's another
Right.
later on down the stream.
Okay.
Argentina ended slavery in 1861. Chile was one of the first to end slavery in 1811, along with Spain,
Mm-hmm.
being a former Spanish colony. Cuba ended slavery officially in 1867, but didn't practically end it until 1886. Haiti, obviously one of the first through violent revolution, ended slavery for blacks, in particular blacks, in 1804. West Africa didn't end slavery until officially when French rule came over in 1875. However, slavery still existed in an informal manner in sub-Saharan Africa until 1920. The United States.
Yeah, and I get the feeling that, and I don't have the the stats and everything, but I gather that in certain parts of North and Sub-Saharan Africa, slavery never really ended.
Yeah,
whatever the laws were,
Yeah, again, there's a difference between it being something on the books and something happening in reality. Obviously,
de facto,
there's a black mark for every market. Yes.
Yeah.
De facto versus de jure. The United States ended slavery in 1865, but obviously there was quote apprenticeship programs unquote, which required the military going back in and a reconstruction to enforce the abolishment of slavery. The United Kingdom, again, one of the first, ended slavery in 1807 with William Wilberforce. Great movie about him, by the way. If you want to go check that out.
Yes,
Right.
agreed. What's it called?
Amazing Grace.
Crap. Amazing Grace. Yes, totally recommend. I'll share the IMDb page. Keep going.
Yes. Now France was very surprising. France flip-flopped on this.
I actually saw that movie in the theater.
Sorry?
Go ahead.
Okay. France is very interesting. France in 1794 outlawed slavery. However, Napoleon reintroduced slavery into the French Empire.
Really?
And then,
Huh.
yes, he reintroduced slavery into the French Empire as he wanted to have an French American empire off to the west in the New World. And so reintroduced it in order to make a buck to try and finance this expedition. After Haiti revolted, his ambitions for a American France in the Louisiana area was obviously gone, and he sold the Louisiana lands to the Americans and gave up any
Yeah.
idea of a New World French Empire. But
The Louisiana
after
Purchase. Purchase is how we call it here. Yeah.
right, and after which only in 1848 did France re-illegalize slavery. So it took them a while to come back around to the idea of abolishing slavery. French India, which is obviously the colonial holdings in French India, also in 1848 were relinquished slavery. But very interestingly, British India didn't give up slavery until 1861. Very late to the game, especially for the British.
Really?
Yes. And then finally, we have the Ottoman Empire. This is where it becomes very complicated because the Ottoman Empire, while the Sultan himself discouraged slavery and didn't like to own slaves, he did own slaves. And not only did he own slaves, his family owned slaves, and it wasn't outlawed until the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the establishment of the Turkish Republic, to where in 1930 it wasn't illegal to own a slave, but it was practically de facto illegal to own a slave. While it wasn't on the books illegal, it was de facto illegal. And not until 1964 did the Turkish Republic put laws on the books and ratify them for slavery to be outlawed. So that's the sort of general makeup. A lot of countries, especially in South America, the big ones being Brazil and Argentina, were latecomers to abolishing slavery. And a lot of the Caribbean countries as well were latecomers to abolishing slavery because so much was tied into it, politics and their economic ties and the high turnover rates and the well-established relationships between the sellers, buyers, and producers. So that's a basic
Okay.
outline of when slavery was abolished in all of these countries.
Right. Yeah. I mean, actually getting into abolition and the sort of what happened after that is actually beyond what we're going to cover today, because I have lots to cover just about slavery, understanding slavery itself. But yeah, that gives us a bookend on the other end. Okay. So, right. So raised versus purchased. Tulloch says low price of slaves who had been captured rather than raised meant they could be treated quite differently from the more expensive slaves who were raised. The captured slaves could be given standards of sustenance which were not likely to keep them alive very long, be overworked, be subject to disciplinary measures which might lead to death. So, and you were hinting at this already, it would appear that the slaves imported from Africa to the Caribbean sugar plantations or to Brazil had a life expectancy of about 5 years. So that, like you said, we'd need to understand more about the institutions and the incentives that were in place. I'm sorry. Let me make one more comment before I talk about that. Then Tulloch goes on to say, as far as we can tell, during the parts of Roman history in which frequent wars led to frequent captures of slaves, the treatment and life expectancy were rather similar. So when there was a relatively cheap, relative to raising someone, relatively cheap influx of slaves, either into Brazil or into Rome, then they treated them like crap, and they died something more like what we saw with the labor camps, the communist and Nazi labor camps. Maybe not quite that bad, but close to that.
Well, and just to explain to people why that might be, this makes
Yeah,
perfect sense. Imagine just simple supply and demand. If you have a shift to the right in the supply of slaves,
right.
and demand is maybe increased because of the availability of labor, then the quality that they're going to be treated is going to go down. Just like the
Hmm.
price of, we're replacing the price of a slave, although that would also go down, with the quality of how well they're treated. And when you imagine it like that, the quantity going up, and therefore you no longer need to treat them with such quality, well, you can begin to understand why millions and millions and millions and millions of people were brutally treated.
Right. Um, okay, so he goes on to say the fact that the only two major cases of significant economic utilization of slaves began during the period of the worst Roman wars and when slaves could be freely captured in Africa is at least some evidence that the system is only viable when captured slaves are available. So he's basically saying we are not going to expect to see slavery on this mass scale unless basically you have a cheap, well, artificially cheap, right? Cheap supply because they're being captured in war, or in the case of Africa, they're being sold by other Africans. And that's the other part of this history that's uncomfortable for people. And I notice it doesn't get talked about that much. The slavery was already happening in Africa prior to the Europeans' presence. Um, and so Tulloch points out that, well, we'll get into that more a little bit later, but he says African kings were in competition with each other, slave ships were in competition with each other. What happens when there's competition? Well, it brings down the rate of profit because, basically if you're charging too much, someone else competes with you and charges a lower price. And so Tulloch says it is a sobering thought that this trade, which inflicted such extraordinary suffering on the blacks who were seized by force and shipped across the Atlantic under appalling conditions, produced no more than ordinary profits for the enterprises involved. So, manumission, that is freeing a slave. This is really important because how would slave, once made a slave, how would a slave become free? They could escape or they could be freed, formally, legally freed, which is called manumission. And why would you do manumission? Okay, so Tulloch says it is frequently possible to get as much, perhaps more labor from a slave as from a free man if the slave is given the reward of eventual freedom for his extra work. So basically, you'd cut a deal with your slave. This guy doesn't seem very motivated, not as compared to, the free labor I could hire. What can I do? Well, okay, you're not going to be that much use to me once you're 40 anyway, or whatever. So how about this? You do some good work, and I don't know how they would do it, but you get points if you work hard, and if you continue to work hard, then you can buy yourself out of slavery, or I'll just grant you the slavery once you're 40, something like that. And one scholar points out that the slave would normally be willing to pay more for his freedom than his market value to another slave owner. As he rather grimly put it, the slave will pay a higher price because he has a sentimental attachment to his own body. Pretty dark humor there, but correct, right? You're going to pay more to free yourself than maybe you would be of value to anyone else. And so when this would happen, both master and slave would benefit from the bargain. Because the master would get better work and the slave would get to be free. And so Tulloch argues the shortage of major slave systems in history comes simply from the fact that slaves and masters normally, perhaps after only a generation or two, they notice this opportunity. They realize, this could work out. We have a win-win scenario here. I buy my freedom and you get motivated work from me instead of, grudging, do as little as I can get away with work. So,
Right, and this is a very crude form of incentives.
yeah,
It's not a wage, but it's a very crude
right.
form of a long-term incentive.
But it's an incentive instead of just there's no hope except working
Exactly.
forever and getting nothing for it, right? Um,
Exactly.
and slave labor is not very efficient usually because of that. Okay, so the question becomes, why didn't manumission end slavery in the South? Well, one reason is legal restriction. We'll learn that about more. And another was social pressure. Why would there have been social pressure? Well, the individual slaveholder um, would have been better off if he could have made a deal with his slaves to sell them their freedom. Large numbers of free Negroes, however, sorry, again, this is Tulloch writing in 1967, I think, however, would have endangered the property rights of the slaveholders and those that were still fully or partially owned. Thus, the slaveholders had a motive collectively to favor laws against manumission, in spite of the fact that each one would have benefited from permission to manumit his own slave, as if he were the only one given such permission. That is, what this sounds a lot like is similar to the logic of a cartel, right? If we all agree together to keep our price at a certain place, we can all benefit. But the incentive to cheat the system is very strong because you individually can benefit by selling it, underbidding your cartel partners. So similarly, slaveholders as a group collectively saw a benefit in preventing the freeing of slaves, but individually, for the reasons just explained, you could get better work out of your slave. Um, okay, so let's see. What else do I want to cover? You had a picture you wanted me to bring up. Um, oh, good. Yes, let's do this real quick. I have more economic analysis to give you, but let's look
I will be your
at.
history guide for today's episode,
Yeah, please.
rather
A
than
little
an
bit
econ
of
side.
where the slaves were coming from. What did they call these? The coast states, or even the slave coast states, something like that,
Uh,
right? Because the ones along the coast are where they're actually selling them off to.
can you increase the size?
Let's see here. Yeah, hopefully that's better.
Right. As you can see, there's numerous kingdoms here. Um, Obviously, all of them are vying for control. As I mentioned before, you can see in the center there, you can see the Mali. Um, but many of these wars had a huge effect on. We're mostly talking about the European side and the Europeans that um, benefited from slavery. But let's have a talk about Africa.
Right.
As excuse me, um, as people will know, in the beginning. So this is a map of 1625, I believe, if my memory serves me correct. In the beginning, the Europeans, especially the Portuguese and the Spanish, would trade wine, manufactured goods, swords, guns, proper steel, um, to these sub-Saharan African groups. And these sub-Saharan African groups, in return, from their constant warring, as you can see, there are many states there, many tribal states there, who over time would just war with each other for various reasons, um, would sell the captive slaves that they had captured in battle, men, women, and children, to the Portuguese and Spanish, and later on other nations like France and Britain and America. These slaves, who were purchased with the trade of the materials I mentioned, would be shipped to the South America, or the Caribbean, Central America, and North America. Now let's give some perspective here. South America, over the 400-year history of the Atlantic slave trade, about 3.8 million people were sold from Africa to South America, in particular Brazil and Argentina. To the Caribbean, so this is Haiti, Cuba, various other states, 3.2 million were sold. To America, somewhere roughly between 400 and 650,000 were sold. So North America, relatively speaking, uh, compared to the other two destinations that Africans could be sent, was the smallest of the three, and also was the one with the highest life expectancy.
Right. So you didn't have. We mentioned that there was the 5-year life expectancy in Brazil and the Caribbean, and
Right. This was in the other hand,
better if you made it to North America.
in the United States, it was more like 20 years. So there's a significant difference there. Now you may be asking yourself, why is there a significant difference, and why is the turnover rate and the numbers required for slavery so much higher in South America and in the Caribbean? Well, the answer is very simple: is that the work and the environment there is much different, and the colonial structure there is much different. The Spanish and the Portuguese systems were much more um, uh, were much more exploitive than the British system, to put it one way. Essentially, the Spanish system extracted wealth and didn't leave anything for the colonists or the slaves or the natives, and simply shipped the majority of the wealth back to the mother country. There's a brilliant book, if I can find it, Why Nations Fail. Why Nations Fail outlines why the Spanish model and the Portuguese model is less prosperous and more focused on wealth extraction than the Anglo model. And this difference also explains why, apart from the environment, obviously tropical Brazil and Caribbean is much harder to deal with than North American temperate climates. But this difference in governance model can explain very much so why the turnover rate was much, much higher. Simply, they did not care about developing these colonies into prosperous states, rather just extorting the resources such as gold and sugarcane and silver and tobacco. Uh, Now, we're going back to our trade route. The Europeans come in, they trade finished manufactured goods to the African states on the slave coast. These slaves are then shipped to the Caribbean, South America, and North America, and then sold to plantation owners or whatever owners happen to buy them. These funds are then used to purchase sugar, tobacco, molasses, other cash crops, to which these cash crops are then sent back to Europe for finished manufacture. For example, sugar would be turned into rum, and tobacco would be rolled into uh, shredded for pipe tobacco, or rolled into tobacco for cigars, which was becoming a big craze at the time. Especially, I believe, in Denmark, there were some very, very tobacco masters and different sorts of things. Um, then these manufactured goods would then again be sold and sailed down to the slave coast, and the whole process would repeat itself. So you have this triangle of trade, but it is still not good, because the involuntary partner in all of this, obviously, are the slaves. And I think we'll
Right.
get onto the part about how many people believe this to be free trade, but we would say this is not free at all, because the most
No.
glaring example of the unwilling partner in all of this is the slave.
Actually, my old friend who's in the chat as Sellout Satirist asked and got a good answer. Let's highlight those. And I think that gets us into this aspect of it. What is the difference between a manumission arrangement and indentured servitude? Hybris gave a excellent answer. Oops, not that one. Where is it? I saw an answer. There we go. Sorry, current. Current. Commenter. Indentured servitude was entered into with the consent of both parties. Slaves tend not to consent until death or a bargain for freedom. So, yeah, as I understand it, at least in the Americas, indentured servitude was pretty much just a job. It didn't mean that you had like this lowly status, that you could be treated any way they wanted to treat you. It was just you were taking a certain job. I think the one we tend to hear about is that to get passage to the Americas, you promise to work this job for a certain number of years, right? Probably for relatively under market wages. So they could scrape off the extra amount, the difference between hiring someone who is just completely free agent, wasn't in one of these contracts, and what they paid you or provided you in terms of food and lodging, and that paid off the them getting you over, paying passage for you over the New World, something like that. But as I understand it, you were not. Indentured servitude makes it sound like you were a slave, and I don't think you really were. Certainly not in comparison to chattel slavery that we're talking about here. So yeah, that's one of the big things. And I'm sorry, I have to call this out. JG says the Danes were behind the slave trade. Those Danes. Okay.
Perhaps on the finished products of tobacco they were, but apart from that, I don't know.
Okay, so I wanted to highlight two things about slavery being in Africa. As I said, slavery existed in Africa long before contact with European traders. In fact, slavery was a central, indeed prominent institution of African statecraft. In other words, it was really built into the way they ran, the rulers in these African nations or tribes or whatever ran things. And the paper goes into more detail on that. But anyway,
I would
says,
also like to.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
One more fact here. When the Portuguese began trading in Africa in the 1480s, they purchased slaves largely for resale within Africa. So that's interesting. Go ahead. What were you going to say?
Well, I was just about to say, obviously these Africans who were captured in battle were warriors, and warriors by the very nature are mostly men. And so what you had were significant demographic changes in Southwest Africa. Because if you have all the strong, warrior-like, productive people in your society going off to another land, all that is left are the old, the very young, and the weak. And this has dramatic effects on the ability to not only just procure slaves in the first place to continue this awful trade, but also for civilization development and for the productivity of society. And so you're seeing this labor and brain drain from Africa, which hurts the development. Now again, it was Africans selling other Africans, but it didn't. But this slavery hurt them all because they were losing the young people, which would be needed to advance from the state that they were in.
Yeah. Your men being captured or sold off or whatever is not the road to economic growth, right?
Right. Even
you could say
by selling the other tribes' men in a roundabout way, you are actually hurting your own civilization.
Right. Right, because as Julian Simon taught us, people are actually the ultimate resource, it turns out. But so now I want to turn to two papers from Mark Thornton, where Mark Thornton, a longtime resident at the Mises Institute, last Last time I was there, he tends to be the MC when there's a conference. He's the one introducing speakers and keeping everything orderly. Very tall man. Maybe that's why he's the MC. I don't know. But nice guy. And I mostly associate Mark with a book called The Economics of Prohibition, where he does an economic analysis of, like drug and alcohol prohibition and that sort of thing. And it's great work. I probably referenced it on this show. I did not realize until doing the research for this show that he'd made some really significant contributions on the economics of slavery. So I want to draw from him for the rest of what I'm going to share here. So the institution of slavery prevented the basic elements of a capitalist society from taking root in the South. I thought that was interesting to share. The true economic profits of slavery occurred in the past when slave hunters exploited the original supply of slaves. The original price would have reflected the anticipated present value of the flow of net revenues over time. The price would also have included the anticipated present value of the net revenues from slave breeding. So in the long run, so he's basically saying slave hunting was really where the profit was. But in the long run, even slave hunting would only yield a normal market return on investment because of competition, right? There was, until they started abolishing the slave trade and so forth, anybody could get a ship and go to Africa and buy slaves. So Rothbard argued, Thornton's paper is talking about a note he found from Rothbard on this topic. Rothbard is arguing that from a long-run equilibrium view, that in the short term, slave hunters could earn an economic profit, while subsequent owners would only earn a normal operating profit, all else held equal. So what does this all mean? It means that any detection measurement of profits in the real world in slavery would be the result of some factors other than slavery. And that would be laws against manumission and things like this. So let me just be explicit where this is all going. Again, giving away the punchline, which is that slavery has sometimes been viewed by people as a market institution. And the point of Thornton's two papers here is that it's not. It actually doesn't exist, can't survive against the forces of the market. It can only survive when it's essentially being subsidized. It's unnatural in that sense. It's something that happens because of the state, in the sense of a full slave system like this. So what were the factors that increased the profitability of slave-based agriculture? And these are, to some degree, state actions, not all. The U.S. Constitution Slave Clause, the 1793 Fugitive Slave Act, the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, which helped an aspect of cotton processing, but left in place the role of the cotton picking, the slaves who were picking the cotton. The Industrial Revolution, which played into the triangle that I'm still displaying there, right? The Industrial Revolution would have caused a demand for those raw materials that Mad Merc was talking about. It shows tobacco and sugar here, but also, cotton and so forth. The expansion or strengthening of slave codes and slave patrol statutes. We'll learn more about that. And these were laws designed to prevent runaways by socializing the costs of slave security. And of course, the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. So one of the things to keep in mind, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of the war between the states, or as it's incorrectly called, the Civil War in the United States. But bear in mind that the federal government was a part of what was keeping the whole mess going, because the Fugitive Slave Acts. It meant that everyone in the United States, whether they were in a slave-owning state or not, was drafted into keeping the slave system going. You were required by law to return runaway slaves. Of course, there was heroic resistance to this and so forth, but it was part of the legal apparatus that kept the whole thing going. So Rothbard's conclusions Slavery itself was not economically profitable past the early slave hunting stage and was just generally inefficient. And political forces were the primary factor keeping the system from withering away. So it requires government support to remain viable. Okay, so now I want to show you this paper. Just what's the best way to show you here? Because this is a really key paper here from the Review of Austrian Economics. Let's see here. I'm going to share this real quick. I can get it right. There we go. Okay, so the rest of my comments are drawn from this really key paper where he's responding to various arguments, most famously made in a book called Time on the Cross. And what they argue in Time on the Cross is that slavery was profitable, and so there had to be a big war to end it. And Thornton, basically it was a market institution, and you had to have a political intervention to stop the natural market, I don't know if natural is a good word to use here, but sort of this capitalist institution was never going to end unless there was a big political action. It was a problem of the market that had to be fixed by the state, to be blunt. And Thornton doesn't buy that, right? Because we see slavery as a product of war, as I said earlier, not a product of the market, really. Okay, so there were statutes that prevented in-migration, and there were statutes that required immigration with an E, out. We'll learn more about those in a moment, and restricted the movements and rights of free blacks. So these slave codes, as they were called, significantly reduced the costs and risks of the slave owner by reducing and socializing the enforcement costs of slavery. So that's what you got to remember. Manumission and runaways. Those are the two things that historically kept a slave system from going on and on and on. You'd have a war, you'd capture some slaves, but after some time, they'd either run away or they would earn their freedom or be given their freedom or something like that, right? That's what happened in most of the history of the world. In these two cases, the Greco-Roman and the Americas, you had an exception to that general pattern of basically the market eating away at the slave system. Slavery is a political institution, worth stating the obvious, that is based on the use of force, not contract. You don't have a contract with your slave, right? You just make them do things. The Atlantic slave trade, rather than being the result of a market process, developed the influence of two non-market factors. First, slavery already existed in the tribal African societies, and that was the source of slaves. So before the arrival of Europeans, there was already slavery. So he's saying that that's a big part of the picture. The Europeans came and they're like, slaves for sale, and they bought them. Secondly, the slave trade was not founded by private firms, but it was established by the colonial powers, which instituted monopolies to exploit the indigenous slavery. So who are the two key companies in scare quotes? The Dutch West India Company was chartered in 1621, and the Royal Company of Adventurers for the Importation of Negroes was formed in 1662. For short, they call that the Royal African Company. But let me just say that name one time since it's all in the title. The Royal Company of Adventurers for the Importation of Negroes. These organizations were companies in name only. They were governmental military structures that had been organized on the basis of the profit motive to allow for independent decision-making on locations in Africa, which were too distant from Europe for direct control. So basically, they were subsidiaries of the states that were backing them. And that's how they were not market phenomenon. Okay, let's see. So there were also government subsidies that played a role here. For example, a British parliamentary subsidy for American indigo was a primary reason for the proliferation of slavery in South Carolina. It was not until England enacted a subsidy for Carolina indigo, because they wanted to suppress indigo from the French West Indies, that the black slave population expanded and surpassed the white population in that region. So you've got government intervention happening in a myriad of ways, right? Obviously, the Africans enslaving other Africans, sub-Saharan Africans, was a government intervention on the part of the African governments, right? Then you had the Royal African Company and so forth, which were really government institutions acting there. Then you had economic interventions like subsidies, artificially causing markets to be there that were being worked by slaves. So again, to really drive home this point that this is the difference between free labor and slave labor. Contractual free labor represents a symmetrical relationship that involves a coordination of individuals' values, efforts, abilities, and resources. Slave labor is an asymmetrical relationship of domination and subordination. Slave labor can possibly be efficient for the slave owner, but cannot be viewed as such for the slave or for society as a whole. Right, so what we've learned, and I think we all believe now, but it was maybe less clear at the time, is that free people are best at finding their place in the extended division of labor, right? A free person knows what their own talents are, knows what their opportunities are, has specific knowledge, that Hayekian dispersed knowledge, right? And it's free individuals who are going to best bring these things to the table so that society benefits as a whole. So slavery is not efficient. And the only way you get this view, I think, from like left-wingers that slavery is somehow has something to do with capitalism is because they think if you work for someone else, then it's a relationship of domination and subordination. We don't view contractual relationships that way. We don't think that's the right way to understand them. Contractual relationships are two people making an agreement, and it might involve, I'm going to direct you in this work, and you're going to agree to be directed in this work. But that doesn't constitute slavery or indentured servitude even. Okay, so here's the stuff about the socialist economy. I think we covered that pretty well. Let's see. Yeah, okay. So the productivity of slaves is less than that of free labor because in slavery, productivity is disassociated from economic reward. So let's put ourselves in the place of the slave owner. I bought the slave and I want to get some work out of them for whatever many number of years. What can I do? Well, one is punishment. And here's a great quote from Ludwig von Mises. He says, "Experience has shown that these methods of unbridled brutalization render very unsatisfactory results. Even the crudest and dullest people achieve more when working of their own accord than under the fear of the whip." So punishment was used, right? And of course, in a slave system, punishment is always sort of, just like our relationship with our governments. Punishment is keeping us in the relationship that we'd rather not be in, right? But as Mises hints here, if you solely rely on punishment, you don't get very good results. So the other alternative to dealing with this are incentives. So in order to stimulate working of their own accord, as Mises talks about, owners must offer incentives for productivity and loosen the bonds of slavery. And in particular, the more productive and capital-using applications of labor require even greater incentives and freedoms if you're going to get effective decision-making and care of capital from the slave. And so what you see is that they talked about slaves who were in towns and who were working in skilled labor, a blacksmith or something like that. They were working with equipment. They had to use skill. They were usually going to be treated quite differently than someone who's out there in the fields being driven by a whip or whatever. And those were often, the town slaves were often ones who would end up being able to buy their slavery, buy themselves out of slavery if there weren't laws against it. And so the self-interest of the master therefore can reduce the degree of slavery, resulting in a relationship that gets closer to family or friendship rather than, like a Nazi work camp or a Soviet work camp. Okay, so let's see. Why was slavery viable in the South? Free labor was relatively scarce in the Cotton Belt. The weather and isolation of the Cotton Belt reduced the supply of free labor. Cotton as a product was simple to produce. As quality and complexity of production increases, slave labor becomes less competitive with free labor, right? So the slave system worked better when you had something very simple that you could just have an overseer watch them and, yep, they're picking the cotton, right? If it becomes more complicated, like a blacksmith, it's much harder for someone to supervise them, and you end up doing better to give them a lot of freedom or just hire free labor to do it. Let's see. Okay, and then one other thing that was going on here is that was used as an argument in Time on the Cross and the research, this papers it was based on. The argument that the slave system would just keep on going is that the price of slaves actually was going up throughout this whole period. Prices of slaves were higher at the end of the antebellum period than at the beginning. That is, they were higher right between the war between the states than they had been in the 1600s and 1700s. Of course, part of what that means is when we see higher prices for something, what does that mean? You're going to look for substitutes for slave labor. The more it rose, we would have expected that free labor would have been used instead, or labor-saving equipment, as we see right now with all these left-wing places in America that are doing $15 minimum wages and then are shocked and surprised when the company puts in some kind of robot or automated system instead of hiring $15 workers to do something that you could do with equipment. So what was actually happening near the end there is that slavery was fleeing from the competition of free labor and urbanization towards the isolated virgin lands of the Southwest. So it was actually being eaten away around the edges in the upper South and so forth. The character of antebellum slavery had changed to reflect the loosening of bonds. So over time, slaves were given increasing responsibility, received professional training, began to possess a good deal of independence and property even within the plantation. The slave was moving off the plantation in some cases, becoming in effect free labor for hire. So you find cases where a slave hires their work out, like if they're a blacksmith or something. They hire their labor out, and then they just have to pay a certain amount to their owner each year. And anything they make above that, they get to keep. And so they become very efficient, more efficient and motivated and incentivized, right? So why did unprofitable slavery persist with all these factors militating against it? The slave codes. Mises writes, the abolition of slavery and serfdom could not be affected by the free play of the market system, as political institutions had withdrawn the estates of the nobility and the plantations from the supremacy of the market. So the estates, the plantations were being protected from market forces, you could say, shielded from market forces by laws. So what were these laws? Two typical statutes that significantly reduce the private cost of slavery. One, slave patrol. Well, I'll explain in detail in a moment. Slave patrol statutes socialized the cost of policing slavery and recapturing runaway slaves by drafting non-slave holders into slave patrols. Secondly, there were statutes prohibiting or effectively restricting private manumission of slaves. So the slave patrols dealt with the runaway problem, and laws against manumission dealt with the problem of people, slave owners and slaves striking a bargain, which resulted in the slave being eventually freed. What were these patrol statutes like? Get ready for this. The patrol statutes required all white males to participate in slave patrol duty. So Southern whites, that most of which would not own slaves, right? It was a very small portion of the white population that were actually slave owners. Whites who did not own slaves, many of them quite poor, were basically drafted into slave police, runaway police, right? Failure to participate in the patrols or to carry out organizing responsibilities would result in a series of escalating fines. The patrols were responsible for patrolling the roads at night, monitoring the movement of blacks by checking their passes, and inspecting slave residents. The compensation for the patrollers for being drafted into this was the violence they inflicted upon slaves. So it mentioned that the slaves were very afraid of the slave patrols, unlike their owners who had an interest in, them being useful for a long term. The slave patrols didn't care. They were drafted into this. They were not happy about it, and they just beat you to death or something. So they were very frightened of the slave patrols. And also they would get money for, let me finish one thing. They'd get money for and selling unclaimed runaway slaves. So they'd get bonuses basically if they captured a slave, or if no one claimed it, they could actually sell the slave and get the money from that. Go ahead.
Well, I was about to say, this is people describe this as a power rush when a kid gets a whole monitor role, right? They get the power rush.
Exactly.
Some people are just zealots about it, but this is just a case as we would describe as psychic profit. Obviously, these people are not, but they could be paid, but the majority of what they gain from this is not monetary, but psychic profit, as we would say.
Right, exactly. But okay, well, let me tell you about the one more restriction, and then I think our picture of the slave system is complete. Manumission restrictions there's the patrols to deal with the runaway issue, and then legal restrictions on freeing slaves to deal with slaves getting freed that way. Restrictions precluded slaves from buying their freedom, owners from granting freedom, and owners from manumitting their slaves in a last will and testament. I wonder if I can find this quote real quick. Somebody said it basically, oh yeah, here we go. If slave owners had had more personal control over their property, more slaves would have been freed and the character of slavery would have been much different. So it's kind of weird. We always think of this system as chattel slavery, personal ownership of the slaves. But in fact, as you can see, this was a system and everybody ended up sort of trapped in it, right? The slaves obviously were trapped. The slave owners couldn't make deals that were to their benefit, which would also be win-win with the slaves. And then you had people who weren't even slaves or slave owners who were getting drawn into it. So like everybody was drawn into this system because it wasn't a natural market phenomenon, and they had to twist their whole society into a pretzel to keep it going, So let's see. I wanted to make sure to talk a little bit about the free blacks. I think we'll end up really covering that more in a future part of this series, because an important part as we move from thinking about slavery and slave owners and into the experience of the American blacks themselves and the economic history of American blacks, you've got to start with the blacks who were already getting free prior to the war between the states. And that definitely happened. So these statutes that I just described about the slave patrols and against manumission go back. So that's prior to the colonies, the War of Secession, the War of Independence. So that's prior to the colonies being separate from the United Kingdom. And a relaxation occurred of these after the American Revolution for a period there. During this time, a large number of slaves were freed, both in slave states as well as in states that had newly prohibited slavery. And I'll give you some percentages in a moment. But then a growing free black population. So blacks were getting free. There was a a bunch of the amount percentage of blacks that were free was growing rapidly after the War of Independence. But that growing population, increased threat of slave revolts, and an abolitionist movement led the southern states to reenact severe statutes and put all this stuff in place much more harshly in the several decades before the war between the states. So what were the impact of all this? Well, it shifted the cost of guarding slaves and escape prevention from the slave owner onto the general population. The white males who owned no slaves had to participate in the patrols, right? So it was a socialization of police or security costs for the slave owners. It improved the profitability of slave ownership, and it reduced the supply of free labor because there was a tax on the free people, right? On the margin, if you were in the South and you had an opportunity to go somewhere where you were not going to have to be part of a slave patrol, it was one more incentive to do it, right? I don't have to spend my time patrolling the roads at night or whatever if I move out west where some of my family's gone or whatever. So it both improved the profitability of slave ownership and reduced free labor. And of course, free labor is in competition with slavery, right? So that kept the system going. And then the interaction effect between the laws against manumission and the slave patrol affected the cost and profitability. If slaves couldn't be freed, then most blacks were slaves. And that made the task of the slave patrols easier. If you've got a bunch of free black communities, it's hard to find one that is, an escaped slave because he's just lost among all the other. It's harder to detect an escaped slave. The ability to detect and identify possible runaways was further strengthened by statutes that required all freed slaves had to leave the state or the county. So that was the out-migration, the enforced out-migration. Free blacks were not allowed to immigrate to come into the state. And they would put fines or just outright make it illegal for free blacks to be in their area. So they were artificially, the natural thing that would happen through history is that people would disappear off, escape, or be freed and disappear off into the free communities, and it'd become more and more expensive to maintain a slave system. Well, they put all these laws in place to keep the slave system going at a very high cost. Okay, so let's see. Yeah, by 1830, most slave states had enacted extremely stringent laws to maintain slavery. So free black population in the slave states increased throughout the antebellum period, but the greatest growth was in the early decades and in the Upper South in particular. Well, I'll jump to that in a moment. The rate of increase in the free black population slowed because of these statutes. In the final decades of the antebellum period, the rate of increase of the free blacks fell below the rate of increase of the population. So the laws against manumission really had a huge impact. But it didn't have to be that way. The 1790, in the United States, we have a census every 10 years on the even, years. Between the 1790 and 1800 census, the free black population of America increased by over 82%. And in the South Atlantic states, it increased by over 97%. So had it continued at that same rate from 1800 to 1860, as it did between 1790 and 1800, every slave in the South Atlantic states would have been freed twice by 1860. That is, this system would have died a natural death if they hadn't put all these laws in place to keep it going. So what's the point of all this? Slavery is always and everywhere a political rather than a market institution. And failing properly to identify the causes of slavery survival would be like complaining that business is doing little to alleviate high teenage unemployment without mentioning the minimum wage law. So you cannot understand slavery in the Americas without understanding that it was a creature of the state. The fugitive slave laws, the federal government was involved, northern states were involved, and obviously all these laws in the South preventing, requiring people to serve on slave patrols, just huge amounts of costs were being offloaded, right? Socialized into the rest of society to keep this thing going. It was a mess economically. Let's put it that way. So that's the economics. Anything else you want to cover before we go to super chats?
Just that what we're talking about here is particularly the American system. As we mentioned before, the Portuguese and Spanish systems were obviously very much state-backed and very similar, but just far more brutal as well. So,
right.
Just to make it clear, we're talking there about, and the majority of slaves went to the Portuguese and Spanish holdings. So the majority of slaves did not have the opportunity to earn their freedom under a more, I don't want to say gracious or humane system, because obviously it wasn't humane, but flexible system.
Right.
Like
yeah. Well,
Anglo system.
We can do nuance, right? And
right.
Just outright slaughtering everybody is worse than as bad as enslaving them is, right? Working people to death within 5 years is worse than them being able to live out their lives and not be worked to death, right? In turn, it's better if slaves could earn their freedom, could buy their freedom, could be manumitted, than if they were going to be perpetually slaves. There's gradations here from none of these things are there's no good slavery, but there's worse and there's better. We can make that kind of distinction. I want to mention one book which summarizes what I'm talking about and does much more. Like I said, I didn't want to get into the war between the states, but let's see if I can show this. This is one of the guys I've met at the Mises Institute, Jeffrey Rogers Hummel. He wrote a book called Emancipating Slaves, Enslaving Free Men, A History of the American Civil War. And he includes the arguments that I've been going through here from Mark Thornton and Mises and Rothbard and so forth, and Tulloch, Gordon Tulloch. I wanted to mention, as a teaser to this book, which I hope the title alone intrigues you, but here's where he got the title. It's from a quote from Abraham Lincoln in 1838. Lincoln said, "Towering genius thirsts and burns for distinction, and if possible, it will have it, whether at the expense of emancipating slaves or enslaving free men." I thought that was one of the most chilling quotes I've ever heard and wanted to share it with you. As you may or may not know, I do not consider Lincoln a good guy. But that's a topic for another time. So, anything else on the history of it? Yeah. Anything else on the history of slavery? I've shared everything I wanted to share. Anything else on the history of slavery before we go to discussion?
Yes. So let's bring it back a bit. Obviously, 1807, the British. I saw this in the chat, and so yes, I will mention it very briefly as we sum up. Even though it was a very important part in the ending of slavery and the slave trade. 1807, the Slave Act is the Slave Abolishment Act is passed in Great Britain. Later on, I forget when. I believe it was 1814, if I'm not mistaken. Although do not quote me on that. Please look this up. The British spent 40% of their national budget on the West Africa expedition, I believe it was called, or West Africa. What's the word? Brigade, not brigade. Adventure or something like that. But it was basically a fleet of ships that would go along and raid and try and take slave ships and then free these slaves back in West Africa. Basically, they would take the ships and take the slave occupants home and execute and try the squadron. Thank you, Sunny Jim. West Africa Squadron. And they would take these ships back to Africa in an attempt to stop the illegal slave trade. Um, Now, this was very successful to all the naysayers that prohibition doesn't work. Obviously, it can in some instances. But this prohibition on slavery was enforced by the West African Squadron, which was then later adopted by other nations like France and other empires in trying to eradicate the slave trade. Um, Now, another thing, slavery in many nations, especially within the Middle East and Africa, still goes on today. We should not think of this issue as merely something that is in the past and that is something that is no longer affecting us. Slavery obviously still happens today. It is estimated
I
that about
gather.
40 million,
Go ahead.
40 million slaves are still on Earth.
Right,
Uh,
and we've focused on Africa and North Africa and the Middle East, but I gather that there's also slavery in parts of Asia, which I
yes.
just know less about because I don't know as much about Asia. So I don't even know like which parts of Asia the slaves would be.
Right, and maybe this is after we focus on American slavery, we can, and our coming series on American blacks, um, in economic terms and how basically very much so they have been screwed throughout history. But perhaps after this we could do a series on Asian slavery and the forces around that, because I think that's a topic that not many people really focus on, especially in our Euro American centric
Right, in the
circles.
Anglosphere. Yeah, good point.
Anglosphere.
In fact, that's of course one of my hopes is that by you being in Australia, you'll bring some of these concerns that tend to get ignored by those of us who are so far from Asia. But I think it's quite terrifying that there's still slavery in the world. Like, you grow
Oh
up
yeah.
and you're like, slavery's in the past. That was terrible. It's so terrible. We feel bad about it. Blah blah blah. But it's in the past. Well, it isn't in the past. It turns out it's actually happening on a quite large scale. Um, let's see. Okay, so shall we do super chats?
Let's do some super chats, guys. If you want to have your questions definitely seen, please drop a super chat. Remembering that all the super chats go towards the show. We are not going to be uh, wasting that money. We want to make sure that money is used for the show and used for community activities and building this community up. So, you know that the funds are going to a great place. You will have your questions answered right now, and please drop a few super chats in there so we can stimulate some conversation. So let's
Yeah,
stimulate away.
and just to be clear, this isn't just like being chintzy or something. Literally, I don't know if there's a better tool, and I wish there was, but the chat scrolls off. If you look in your YouTube window and you go up to the top of it, that is not the beginning of the chat. Oh wait, no, that does seem to be the beginning of the chat. Oh, wait a second.
I
Okay,
believe
I might have to look
StreamYard.
at some things. It's
StreamYard
StreamYard that has a limit.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Well, never mind. Okay. Anyway, we'll do super chats and maybe pick around through a couple other things real quick. Okay. So EC90 for £2 British. Aren't we all slaves? The truth shall set you free. I'm all for that. Someday I'll tell you guys the story behind why I chose the name Radical Liberation before I was a libertarian, before I knew about economics or anything like that. Then narco Republican for $5 US. Can muscle drain by slave trade be equated to brain drain by immigration? Isn't it just a modernization of the same process? Right. So this is a concern I've heard raised, and I think it's an interesting concern, or something worthy of discussing, which is that what sometimes happens is that it isn't just random people that are immigrating, say from a less developed country to a more developed country. It's the most talented and the most self-motivated are the ones that are leaving. So, could be quite good maybe for the receiving country, but for the sending country, you're losing a big part of your talent pool. And so that's a brain drain. And Mad Merck was pointing out that this was an impact that was happening with the slave trade, which had already been going on in Africa, as we pointed out, but of course grew with the Europeans coming into the picture. The slave trade would pull people out and send them off to other lands, right? The Americas and so forth. So isn't that, sort of a muscle drain? And that's the way Matt Merck was talking. Yeah, it sounds like it was. I don't know that it would have been a brain drain precisely. I'm sure that too, but I don't gather they were necessarily picking their slaves based on how smart they were. I was seeing some of the stuff about slave prices, and it was mentioning that women were about 80%. A similar age, similar health woman would be about 80% of the price of a man. So they were looking for muscle. I think that's right. Narco-Republican. They were looking for muscle. That's what people were paying for. And so you were losing your young men from your society, your strong men to a great degree, and with the effects that would have on that society. So it'd be a loss to that society. Then Lumberg, for £5 says, is there any evidence that slavery reduced productivity by dissuading investment in tech? And then he says, 1/4 ounce silver right here. Here, let me put I'm sorry, I could have been putting this one on the screen, I bet. There we go. 1/4 ounce silver right here. What does that mean? Mad Merck, I'm not getting Lumberg's comment there about the silver part of it. Not hearing Mad Merck.
Oh, sorry,
okay.
Sorry. I had my. Sorry.
Okay.
£5. It's a 1/4 ounce of silver.
Oh, sorry. Gotcha. See, I'm so deeply in the fiat money system. It's embarrassing. I should be, translating to hard money in my head, right? Or Bitcoin, if I learn more about that. Okay. Anyway, thank you. Is there any evidence that slavery reduced productivity by dissuading investment in tech? Well, yeah, that was that comment, which I think actually came from Rothbard that I read, where he said, what was it? That capitalism didn't take hold in the South. The institution of slavery prevented the basic elements of a capitalist society from taking root in the South. So, yeah, it wasn't just tech. It was just the whole capitalist development you get when you have free people who are, using their initiative and investing their money and starting businesses and stuff like that, right? As I described, you had free labor being driven off in favor of slave labor in these areas. And so free labor, as I said, is like, why do I want to be here and pay for this cockamamie system that's doing me no good? The only good it gets you is that you get to be mean to people and maybe look down on people or something, right? But I suspect that very far, if you're struggling financially, you can't eat those things, right? So, you're barely making ends meet, and then you're having to go out on night patrols. I'm sure that influenced some people to just get out of there, move north, move west, whatever. And so you had less free labor, and the profits generated in the system were going into the plantations, into the slave system. They weren't going into opening up factories and so forth. By the way, ancestrally, I'm kind of on both sides of this, by the way. My mother's mother and father met because my great-grandfather was managing a factory. Of course, this is, many decades after the end of slavery. This was in the 1920s and 30s and stuff. He was managing a textile factory or something like that, in a very poor North Carolina town. And so my grandmother was from was a townie, was one of these poor white Southern families with a lot of kids and hardly anything, and everybody was having to quit school to work and so forth. My grandfather, on the other hand, was from this New England family that had come to this North Carolina town to run this factory. So I have family going back on the New England side, as well as family going back on the poor white Southern side, though North Carolina, from a certain point of view, is barely in the South. Having visited the Deep South, I know the difference. So yeah, I think it was well noted states that the South ran behind the North for a long time. Now, I think more recently, it's not such a simple picture because a lot of time has passed, and yes, California continues to be a economic powerhouse and so forth, but I don't know, if I was starting a company, would I want to be in Raleigh, North Carolina, or would I want to be in New England? I don't know. I think there's some tech centers in certain parts of the Upper South that are doing very well, where they have technology companies there. So the picture has changed over time. But yeah, the South was known for being poor and backwards for a long time. I think even when I was young, that was sort of a picture in people's heads, and it's really not true anymore. But I don't think. But it was the stereotype, the ignorant country bumpkin with the Southern drawl that cartoons. If you watch Bugs Bunny and stuff like that, you'd see it there. It was a part of the culture that these poor backward Southerners, they were behind the capitalist development. Go ahead.
Well, they were, and obviously this is due to the antiquated notions of slavery, but and the absolute destructive effects it has on the market. However, the North, which outlawed slavery, as we know, due to the Mason-Dixie line, was the industrial powerhouse, and during the War of the States, or the Civil War, as some people say, the how can we call this? The North was far more industrially developed, and ultimately, because the war dragged out for so long, this is what eventually won them the war. They were able to have more men, more material, more rifles at that stage. Sorry, I was about to say musket. More rifles, more shells, more of everything, because they were industrialized, because they were not hampered by the strain that is slavery, which retards the South's economy. I mean, retards as in not in some sort of offensive way, but just literally it diminishes the South's economy. Or did, sorry, my mistake.
Okay,
so what's the next one?
That's all the super chats, I believe. I did want to reference one. I was just flipping around through the chat a little bit. Beggar Hero asked more than once, I think, about the main factor in slavery being how much the elites buy into the institution. He says, for example, 36% of whites in the South owned slaves. That is not true. So the Confederacies, just found an article, Confederacies, 11 states had 316,000 slave owners out of a free population of about 6 million. That equals about 5.6%, 5.7% of the free population were slave owners. Yeah, okay, I see. Oh, okay. Where you get the 36% is probably, so that's literally the people owning the slaves. But, if your dad owned slaves, you were part of a slave owning family. If you look at it from that point of view, census of 1860, 31% of the free families in the Confederacy owned slaves. So every third white person in those states had a direct commitment to slavery. That's not a terrible way of looking at it, I think. That those would be people who would, maybe be supporting these measures to keep slavery going. But yeah, I mean, this was totally, well, it's like it always is, and it is now, right? There are unjust systems put in place by the state that a relatively small number of people, small percentage of the population, or a minority of the population, I should say, a minority of the population is able to benefit from it, and the rest of us pay for it. That's how the state scam always works, right? So I'm sure that there were non-slave owning Southerners who thought slavery should be kept around or whatever, but there were probably others who could take it or leave it, right? They had no personal investment in it. So yeah, I mean, it had a lot to do with the slave owners and their political influence, which they got from their ill-gotten gains, right? So that's how the system kept going. Here, in fact, let's see. I'm wondering if I can pull these things up here. That's the problem. When people at me in the, I can't see it as well in the StreamYard's chat. Sorry to pick those out.
Can we highlight one comment, please? It's not related to slavery, but it is erroneous. So,
okay,
Bron Arkham, sorry, Bron Arkham at 9:03. So yeah, the comment is rightists dash. So if you just want to bring that one up, please.
Yeah.
And Arkham.
Ben Arkham. Bon Arkham. Yeah.
Bon
Arkham is a reference, as far as I know, to Batman.
It's very
to Batman.
Yes. For those who don't understand why I can't see the screen, it's because the text is very small on my screen. So I'm trying to read.
Oh well, I put it on the. I've highlighted it, Madmer.
Okay. Yes. So this comment about the Fed printing money.
Well, let me read the comment and then respond. He says, rightists, we want Fed to keep printing money to make capitalists look good while setting the world on fire. Well, I'm not going to defend rightists, but I would say that that's not my position for what it's worth.
I don't think that's any Austrian position.
Right.
I would like to welcome this person to Austrian economics, to where we regularly criticize and call for disbanding of the Fed and the fiat monetary policy of constant injection of capital in it for the benefit of businesses over consumers.
Exactly.
Welcome to Austrian economics. Welcome to our side of the equation. That does not mean you have to support Antifa, but that or adopt socialism. That does mean that you have to understand what the central banks are doing, as we would describe them as Keynesians and crony capitalists are doing.
Exactly.
And the crony word is the important word there, because it's not the free market. It's not laissez-faire, because by the very fact of there being a central bank controlling interest rates and the supply of money, it is not free. So I think to describe this as something that corporatists and statists would want is very accurate. To describe this as something that people who want freedom want is erroneous. So I'd just like to point that out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Person.
And let me just share this from our compatriot Ron Paul, who people might have heard of. Ron Paul was a friend of Murray Rothbard's. He's on the board to this day of the Mises Institute. And so he's right at the heart of the perspective that we're sharing from this. And he wrote a book called In the Fed. And a wonderful moment that I remember from one of his presidential campaigns, where he was speaking at a university or something, and people started burning dollars. Why were they doing that? Because they're Federal Reserve notes. It was a way of protesting the Fed, to burn the money, and say, we don't. It's symbolically saying we reject this system that we're stuck in with the Federal Reserve. So I guess we can agree with the comment in the sense that it's negative towards Fed money printing, I gather, and towards those who benefit from Fed money printing. I agree with it, that far, but I'm not in support of it. And furthermore, capitalism, as I understand it, or if you prefer, if the word capitalism has a toxic meaning for you because you associate it with crony capitalism or corporatism, then just let's call it the free market or free association. Free association does not require a central bank. In fact, most of human history did not have a central bank. And since we've had a central bank, as you may recall, we've had things like the crash of 1929 and other various disasters which continue. Just 12 years ago, we had the crash of the real estate. This is all coming from the central bank. So it's far from being a necessary component of the market system, of a free market system. It's actually toxic and it poisons the system, benefits a few, and puts a bunch of costs on the rest of us, much like the slave system that we've been discussing tonight. So yeah, thanks for picking that one out, Mad Mark. I hadn't had a chance to look that carefully. But if he's still listening, he or she's still listening, welcome. We do like to bring people in to learn that there's some other perspectives out there besides the ones that are presented to us, which is sort of this simplistic left wing and simplistic right wing. Austro-libertarians are kind of something quite different, I think. Anything else that you wanted to pick out before we wrap it up? I didn't get a chance to study the chat very well.
No, it's kind of small for me, so nothing that really sticks out.
You can't see the chat well.
Saying it's, yeah, it's just a bit small on my screen. I'll have to figure out how to change that. But someone is saying the South shall rise again.
I love it, but not sure
about secession. But what else do we have here? Blah blah blah. No, I don't think there's anything else. I think we're good.
Okay, good. Well, I hope this is interesting. I just want to make my motivation clear in wanting to get into this topic, and that is that Black Americans have been on the world stage this year, more than usual, with Black Lives Matter protests, not only in the United States, but spreading to other countries. As my friends in the UK point out, it seems to be really a peculiarly American phenomenon, and yet it's being picked up outside of the United States. It's very much tied up with the history that we're going to be getting into. But the place to start, I suppose, for African Americans, or whatever you want to call them, basically the Black Americans who were brought here as slaves, and at one point or another, some of them well before the War of the States, which we'll focus on next time, became free at one point or another. And then what happened since then? So, we're going to leave off with the slave period mostly, or free. And I think the next part of the story really is the free blacks. Where were there free blacks, and how did they do? What institutions and communities did they build even before the war between the states? And then, of course, what happened afterwards? Well, I don't know how many slaves there were, actually. You'd think I'd have a number. It said there were how many slaves in the Confederate? Let me just get a number, and that'll give us a starting point for our next part. Facts. Let's see. I can't find a good number here. Black slaves. Okay. Okay. Confederate population stood at about 5.5 million whites and 3.5 million black slaves. So 3.5 million African slaves, slaves who had been brought over from Africa or descended from those brought over from Africa, suddenly were freed in around 1864. So 3.5 million. Wow. Oh, and there were other slaves outside of the Confederacy that were freed as well. And I don't know what that number is, but I don't think it's in the millions. Relatively smaller number. But yeah, that's where we take the story up of the Black Americans in our next part of the series. So good to talk to everybody. Thanks, Mad Merc. As usual, just want to occasionally highlight that Mad Merc does the thumbnail, and I liked it a lot, so I was featuring it a lot today. Trying not to just leave an article sitting on the screen all the time, which I realized is not visually very good. So I'm trying to do better, have some charts or some artwork or something up there. So we'll work on that, on some visuals. I tend to focus on what I'm saying, but I know that some people are looking at the screen. So,
just before we
anyway,
go, can I do two things? Firstly, I would like to thank the amazing Anglo who helped me a lot with research about history, even though I wasn't able to get to as much as I would like to. Just a shout out to that brilliant guy for helping me out. And secondly, in the comments below, I will be finding an organization, a charity organization, a link to their website that deals with human trafficking and child sex slavery. I'll be putting that link in the comments if you feel inclined, because of the disgusting nature of what we're talking about and the modern slavery that goes on in our world. If you feel inclined to donate, please find that link in the description or in the comments. And
you might have to do that. You might have to do that before we close out, because I don't know that you can do it afterwards.
I'll put it in the comments.
Oh, you're going to put it, not in the chat, but in the comment. I got it.
Just
makes sense.
Just in the comments.
Good.
If you want, that will be probably pinned at the top of this video. So if you want to donate anywhere to help out slavery in the modern world, fight against it, please look for that comment, and we'll see you in the next video.
Okay. Oh, and let's just mention the Discord real quick. If you're interested in our contest or just want to talk to more people who are interested in these kinds of things, seeing things from the economic point of view, then please join the Discord. It's in the description of the video. And we'd welcome discussion and debate. All right. Thanks. Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.
Wow, it spins and spins. When are we off air?
We're not off yet.
There we go. Oh, an error occurred. Nope.